Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the class of substances that doesn't distort reality, it replaces it. Not with colours that breathe or patterns that shift, but with people who are standing in your room, fully formed and entirely present, until you reach out to hand one of them something, and your hand goes through empty air. The conversation you just had, it did not happen. The cigarette you just smoked, there was no cigarette. The person sitting at the foot of your bed who you've been talking to for the last 20 minutes, that depends entirely on how you define a person, because they were real enough to answer you, and not real enough to exist. This is what separates deliriants from every other difficult drug experience in history, not the danger, not the strangeness. The fact that the part of you that would know something was wrong is the first part to go quiet. But before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off into these stories with me. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about what happens when the mind stops separating imagination from reality. Most of the substances that do this are not exotic. They do not require a laboratory or a dealer or a passport. They come from plants. Ordinary-looking plants with small flowers that have been growing in fields, roadsides and gardens for thousands of years. Several are still entirely legal to purchase. A few are considered weeds. One has been in medicine cabinets since 1943. The antihistamine for hay fever, the one that makes you drowsy, the pink box between the aspirin and the cough syrup. The same mechanism, a different shelf. The most significant group are the nightshades, datura, henbane, belladonna, mandrake. They all interfere with the same neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, which is the brain's way of deciding which signals from the world are real enough to pay attention to. Block it thoroughly enough, and the brain, deprived of that filtering, starts generating its own signals instead. Not vague impressions, not fleeting shapes, fully rendered people, objects, environments, indistinguishable from the real ones by any means the person experiencing them has available. These plants have sent enough people to emergency rooms across enough centuries that physicians developed a phrase for the pattern. Dry as a bone, blind as a bat, red as a beet, hot as a hare, mad as a hatter, dry mouth, dilated pupils, flushed skin, elevated temperature, delirium. The heart races. The bladder stops cooperating. Breathing becomes effortful. At doses that produce meaningful delirium, these compounds are also approaching doses that produce meaningful danger, and the distance between the two is not as comfortable as most people would prefer. The ancient world knew this. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text from roughly 3,400 years ago, mentions henbane in the context of medicine. Dioscorides, the Greek physician whose pharmacology text was copied and referenced for over 1,500 years, documented belladonna, henbane and mandrake in careful detail, including the doses at which each became useful and the doses at which each became something else. The genus name for belladonna, atropa, was taken from Atropos, the Greek fate who cuts the thread of life. That was not accidental. Belladonna acquired its more common name in Renaissance Italy. Belladonna, beautiful woman. Women applied diluted preparations to their eyes, which caused the pupils to dilate and were considered attractive at the time. The pupils stayed dilated for days. This was considered a reasonable trade, aesthetically popular, medically inadvisable, and still substantially safer than what people in other parts of history were doing with the same plant. In other parts of Renaissance Italy, belladonna was being administered to people without their knowledge or consent, for reasons that had nothing to do with attractiveness. Giovanna Tofana ran a quiet business in Naples that expanded over the course of roughly 2 decades to Rome and then Sicily. Her product was called Acqua Tofana, and her clients were primarily married women. What the preparation contained exactly remains somewhat disputed. Arsenic is the most supported ingredient, with belladonna possibly added to produce the delirium that could mask a poisoning in progress. What is less disputed is the scale. By the time Giovanna Tofana was arrested and eventually executed, roughly in the year 1659, her own accounting under interrogation placed the number of deaths attributable to her preparations at somewhere around 600. Husbands, mostly. The church called it diabolical. Historians have noted that in an era when women had essentially no legal means of escaping abusive or violent marriages, Tofana had built an alternative legal system with a very narrow range of outcomes. This was not the only market for these plants. Across the same centuries and across the rest of Europe, henbane, belladonna, datura and mandrake appear in a context that has been discussed, debated, and largely misunderstood for 500 years. The witch's flying ointment. The confessions extracted during witch trials across medieval and early modern Europe have a recurring element. Women described applying a salve, usually to a broomstick or other implement, and then experiencing flight, attendance at the Sabbath, shape-shifting, sexual encounters with presences that were not human. Inquisitors interpreted this as evidence of genuine diabolism, or, in the more charitable readings, as the delusions of disturbed minds. A physician named Johannes Weyer proposed in 1563 a third possibility. These women, Weyer argued, had been poisoned by plants. Not metaphorically, chemically. The experiences they described were not invented and not demonic. They were the predictable result of absorbing plant alkaloids through the skin. Fat-based ointments applied to mucous membranes go in faster than most people would guess, and these women had apparently figured that out long before anyone wrote it down. Modern toxicology has found Weyer's argument substantially more compelling than his contemporaries did. A fat-based ointment containing henbane, belladonna and datura applied to skin would produce transdermal absorption. The alkaloids would reach the brain. The brain would generate the experiences described, not metaphorically, chemically. The women flying to the Sabbath were not flying, but the sensation of flying was real in precisely the way that any other sensory experience produced by the brain is real, which is to say, entirely. The only thing missing was any external referent. The church did not find this argument useful. In Jamestown, Virginia, in the year 1676, a different version of the same chemistry played out without any intention involved at all. British soldiers had been sent to suppress an uprising known as Bacon's Rebellion. Local vegetables were prepared as part of their rations. The vegetable in question was Datura stramonium, known in North America as Jimson weed, a corruption of Jamestown weed, a name it would acquire from this very incident. Robert Beverley, who documented the event roughly 30 years later, described what happened next with the kind of careful neutrality that suggests he was trying very hard not to find it funny. The soldiers fell into a state of delirium that lasted 11 days. They were harmless. One was observed blowing a feather into the air repeatedly. Another sat naked, grinning at the companions he presumably could see, though which companions and whether any of them were actually present is not entirely clear. The soldiers recovered. The rebellion without them concluded in its own way. The datura was not prosecuted. That is worth sitting with for a moment, not because 11 days of delirium isn't dramatic, but because of what the soldiers reported afterward. Not terror, not the memory of something frightening, mostly nothing, a gap where 11 days should be. And this is the quality that puts the substances on this list in a category of their own, not just datura, but the antihistamine in the medicine cabinet, and the sage from the cloud forests of Oaxaca as well. Most drugs that go badly wrong still feel wrong. The panic, the dread, the bad trip, those are the brain's alarm system working. You know something is off. These are the ones where the alarm system is the first thing that stops working. So the experience is not frightening in the way a nightmare is frightening, where some part of you is watching and afraid. It is wrong in a quieter and more complete way. You're having a perfectly normal conversation with someone and find out later that no one was there. You're reaching for objects in a bedroom you have slept in for years, and your hand goes through empty air. You're 6 minutes into something you cannot name, and you no longer have access to the concept of being a person who is having an experience. You do not notice any of this while it is happening. That is the part that has no equivalent anywhere else. Datura did not acquire a reputation for reliability from incidents like this. What it acquired was a reputation for duration. The delirium it produces lasts not hours but days, and the hallucinations it generates are not the alien or cosmic variety. They are ordinary. A person mid-conversation, talking to a family member who's been dead for 6 years. Not distressed, simply talking. This can continue for 2 days. The person remembers none of it afterward. The antihistamine in the medicine cabinet produces the same conversations, the same reaching for objects that are not there, the same shadows at the edge of vision. In a suburban bedroom, in a room the person has slept in for years, which is its own particular quality of wrong. And then there is salvia, which works on an entirely different part of the brain, and which lasts not days but 6 minutes. 6 minutes in which the brain does not replace reality with a false version of itself, but removes the framework that reality normally sits in, including in many accounts the sense of being a person at all. The processing of what happened in those 6 minutes takes considerably longer, partly because the sober brain does not have the vocabulary, partly because the vocabulary was one of the things that was briefly gone. That feature, the inability to distinguish, is not a side effect of the deliriant experience. It is the mechanism. It is what the category means, and it is why the same plants that terrified witch trial accusers, supplied Renaissance poisoners, incapacitated colonial soldiers, and filled emergency rooms across 5 centuries continue to occupy a specific place in pharmacological history that no other class of drug quite manages. Not because they are the most dangerous, though several of them are genuinely dangerous. Not because they are the most widely used, because they are not. Because they are the only ones that reliably remove the part of the brain responsible for the question, is this actually happening? Somewhere in Salem, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1691 going into 1692, a group of girls began to experience things. The accounts that survived describe convulsions, burning sensations crawling under the skin, visions of people and presences that others in the room could not see. The symptoms were reported to the local physician, who examined the girls and arrived at the conclusion that the affliction was not natural. The trials that followed are well known. Less well known is what a behavioural psychologist named Linda Caporael proposed in a paper published in the journal Science in 1976 about what might have caused the symptoms in the first place. The winter of 1691 to 1692 had been wet and warm in the Salem village area. The kind of conditions, Caporael noted, that are ideal for a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which grows on rye and produces a family of compounds called ergot alkaloids. The convulsive form of ergotism, the disease produced by eating ergot-contaminated grain, produces exactly the symptom profile described in the Salem accounts. Burning sensations, visions, convulsions. The afflicted girls were clustered in a specific area of the village where rye was grown. The timing aligned with contaminated grain being in the food supply. Ergot is not a nightshade alkaloid. Its mechanism is different. It acts on serotonin receptors rather than blocking acetylcholine, and its hallucinogenic properties derive from the same chemical family as the compound that Albert Hofmann would later synthesize in a laboratory in 1938 and call lysergic acid diethylamide. The ergot hallucinations are arguably closer in character to psychedelic than to deliriant, but the distinction that matters for Salem is not the pharmacological category. It is the fact that in a small, frightened, deeply religious community, with no framework for understanding chemically induced psychosis, the experience of reality becoming something it should not be had only one available explanation. The explanations those girls provided, and that the community accepted, resulted in 19 executions. Caporael's hypothesis has been disputed, and the social dynamics of the Salem trials extend well beyond anything a fungus can explain. But the pharmacology is plausible. And the broader pattern, a community unable to account for a mass break from shared reality, defaulting to the most terrifying explanation available, is not a 17th century peculiarity. It recurs in different forms across the full history of these substances. The brain, deprived of its own ability to verify what is real, will fill the gap with whatever the culture has ready. What the culture had ready in Salem was the devil. What it had ready in medieval Europe was witchcraft. What it had ready in 21st century Colombia was something that the local newspapers called the most frightening drug in the world. The plant that Colombian newspapers called the source of the most frightening drug in the world is not frightening to look at. Brugmansia grows across South America as a garden ornamental. Large, drooping, trumpet-shaped flowers in white or pale yellow, the kind of thing planted along a fence for aesthetics. It is entirely legal. It is not scheduled anywhere in Colombia. In Bogotá and Medellín, it grows on residential streets. In the early 2000s, journalists began reporting on what people in those cities had started extracting from it. The compound is scopolamine. The extraction is not complicated, and what scopolamine does, in sufficient quantity, is produce two effects in close succession. First, extreme suggestibility. The person will comply with instructions they would otherwise refuse without distress, without apparent awareness that anything is wrong. Second, retrograde amnesia. The person will form no lasting memory of the period of compliance. The crime that scopolamine enables is one that leaves no witness, because the witness was chemically present for the entire event and encoded none of it. The documented pattern: a stranger in a bar, a drink that tastes like nothing in particular. Within an hour, the person is cooperative in ways they would not normally be cooperative. They walk to an ATM. They withdraw money and hand it over. They may sign documents. They may invite people into their home. They return home eventually and fall asleep. They wake up with no memory of the evening past a certain point and begin reconstructing what happened from receipts, from security camera footage of themselves behaving in ways they do not recognize, from the accounts of people who were there and are no longer available. The experience from the victim's perspective is not a gap. It is an ordinary evening that simply stops having a next part. Colombian authorities estimated thousands of scopolamine-facilitated crimes annually at the peak of documented cases. The Vice News documentary that brought the story to international attention in 2012 described victims who had handed over apartments, transferred savings, and in some cases were found days later with no clear account of the intervening time. Some details in that coverage were contested. The so-called blow method, in which scopolamine powder was supposedly blown directly into a person's face for near-instant compliance, was reported as fact despite limited pharmacological support for that specific delivery route. Drink adulteration is documented. The dramatic street corner powder blow is probably more legend than method. The legend, in this case, is only marginally more frightening than the reality. What made scopolamine useful as a crime drug is exactly what makes it interesting. The amnesia is not a side effect of the delirium. It is a separate action entirely. Scopolamine interferes with the part of the brain responsible for writing new memories to long-term storage. The event happens. The brain processes it in the moment. The trace is never written. The crime is not forgotten. It was never recorded. This property had attracted attention long before the Colombian reports. In the maternity wards of European and American hospitals, in the early years of the 20th century, physicians were deliberately deploying it for the same reason. The procedure was called twilight sleep. It combined scopolamine with morphine, administered to women in labour, and the stated rationale was humane. Women would experience childbirth but form no memories of the pain. Not the absence of pain, the absence of the memory of pain. The distinction seemed significant to the physicians who developed it. It seems less significant in retrospect. What twilight sleep actually produced was full anticholinergic delirium. Patients in labour under twilight sleep were not sedated. They were delirious, thrashing, disoriented, responding to hallucinations, screaming. The ward sounds to anyone walking past were not the sounds of a managed medical procedure. Nurses and physicians present witnessed the delirium in its entirety. The patients, when they woke, remembered nothing. The professional consensus that formed around this discrepancy, that suffering without memory did not constitute harm in any meaningful sense, is one of the more uncomfortable passages in the history of obstetric medicine. Standard practice included physical restraints. Patients in delirium could not be reasoned with and would injure themselves or fall from the bed. The restraints were considered a reasonable precaution. The restraints were applied and removed, and the patient woke up not knowing they had been applied. The logic was clean, in the way that logic sometimes is when everyone involved has agreed on a convenient definition. Twilight sleep was practiced across Europe and North America from roughly 1900 through the 1960s. It faded when safer general anesthesia became available, and when patient advocacy, from women who had witnessed it, survived it, or watched others go through it, made the ethical case that the suffering counted whether or not it was remembered. The debate over whether it did took longer to resolve than it should have. The same compound, in the same years that twilight sleep was being wound down, had attracted a different kind of institutional interest. A Texas obstetrician named Robert Ernest House had been working with scopolamine in obstetric contexts, and had become convinced, through observations he found compelling and recorded carefully, that patients under scopolamine told the truth. Not that they were suggestible, that they were honest. He believed the compound stripped away the social mechanisms of deception and left only sincere speech. He coined a phrase for this property around 1922, truth serum. House was not a fringe figure. He presented his findings at medical conferences. He conducted experiments on prisoners, administering scopolamine and recording testimony. He published. He was taken seriously enough that courts were asked to admit scopolamine obtained confessions as evidence. The courts declined consistently on the grounds that the testimony was too unreliable, not because the prisoners were lying, but because delirious people do not suppress information and reveal the truth. They generate content. The brain under anticholinergic blockade produces confabulation, plausible-sounding material that the person experiencing it cannot distinguish from genuine memory, because the systems that would make that distinction are among the first to go offline. House went to his grave convinced the courts had made a mistake. The record of what scopolamine-intoxicated prisoners actually said, when reviewed by anyone not committed to the truth serum hypothesis, reads less like suppressed confession and more like the kind of material a brain produces when asked questions it cannot answer, and has lost the ability to say so. The Central Intelligence Agency was watching. The MKUltra program, which ran from the early 1950s through the late 1960s and was partially declassified following congressional investigations in the 1970s, tested scopolamine alongside lysergic acid diethylamide, mescaline, barbiturates, and a range of other compounds on subjects who had not consented. The specific appeal of scopolamine to the program was the combination of properties House had identified, compliance plus amnesia, applied to interrogation rather than to testimony. A subject who could be made to answer questions and then made to forget the interrogation had occurred was operationally attractive. The results were consistent with everything the courts had already found. Scopolamine produced delirium, and delirium produced noise. A person in full anticholinergic delirium does not have access to suppressed information in a form they can retrieve and articulate. They have access to whatever the brain generates in the absence of its normal verification systems, which is not the same thing. The program eventually concluded what any careful reading of the pharmacology would have suggested at the outset. No compound reliably compelled truth, because truth is not stored in the brain in a form that any known compound can selectively unlock. The declassified MKUltra documents are available in archives. They describe what was done to people who did not agree to have it done to them, in the institutional language of program budgets and efficacy assessments. The banality is not incidental, it is the thing. Scopolamine, having served as crime drug, obstetric tool, proposed truth serum and intelligence program subject, returned to the pharmacy shelf. It is there now, in the form of a small adhesive patch, available by prescription for motion sickness. The patch delivers a dose calibrated, carefully below the threshold at which any of the above becomes relevant. The dose that prevents nausea on a boat and the dose that erases a person's ability to protect themselves are separated by quantity, not by kind. The patch is worn behind the ear. It works well. Millions of people use it without incident every year. All of this, the crime, the ward, the confession, the program, involved the same mechanism. The brain deprived of its verification system, filling the gap with whatever was available. In Colombia, the gap was filled with compliance. In the maternity ward, it was filled with suffering that was officially deemed not to have occurred. In the MKUltra files, it was filled with confabulation the agency briefly mistook for intelligence, before concluding it was something else and moving on to other approaches. The plants did not design any of this. They have no interest in Colombian crime statistics or the history of obstetric ethics or the operational requirements of Cold War intelligence programs. They simply contain the compounds they contain, at the concentrations they contain them, for reasons entirely unrelated to human use. And of all the plants that have been turned toward human purposes in ways their chemistry never anticipated, none has a longer or more thoroughly documented record of doing so than the one that grows on roadsides in Virginia, in gardens in Egypt, in witch trial confessions, in the account of a Roman physician whose text was copied for 1500 years, and which was waiting in a field in Jamestown in 1676 when a group of soldiers ate the wrong salad. Datura. What that salad produced, 11 days of delirium, soldiers blowing feathers, a rebellion that concluded without them, is the accidental version. Everything in this part has been the deliberate version. Humans identifying what these compounds do and deciding to use that property for a specific purpose. The crime, the ward, the program. Each one a different answer to the same question the plants had been posing for thousands of years before anyone thought to ask it deliberately. The question is not complicated. It is, what happens when you remove the part of a person that knows what is real? In Colombia, the answer was, they hand over their money. In the maternity ward, the answer was, they suffer in a way that leaves no record. In the MKUltra files, the answer was, they talk, but what they say is not what you were hoping to hear. And in every case, the people administering the compound had convinced themselves, with varying degrees of sincerity, that what they were doing was either justified or necessary, or, in the case of the crime, simply profitable. The Colombian cases that came to public attention through the Vice News documentary and through subsequent journalism were not aberrations. Scopolamine use in crime had been documented in Colombia since at least the 1980s. The compound's availability from Brugmansia, which grows as a weed in parts of the country, not only as an ornamental, meant that supply was effectively unlimited. The pharmacological knowledge required to extract and concentrate it was available in print and eventually online. What the documentary surfaced was a practice that had been running for decades, largely invisible to international media, because the victims were Colombian, the crimes were non-violent in the sense that no physical force was required, and the evidence was by design absent. The specific horror of a scopolamine crime for the victim is not the event, it is the reconstruction. Waking up and finding things missing is a common enough experience with ordinary intoxicants. Waking up and finding that you move through your own evening as an agent, making decisions, travelling across the city, completing transactions, with no access to any of it, is something different. The footage exists. The receipts exist. The account of the person who guided you to the ATM exists somewhere, in the memory of someone who is not going to provide it voluntarily. You were there. You were entirely yourself in every observable way. You simply were not present. The twilight sleep wards produced a version of this from the other direction. The patients were not deceived into compliance. They were administered a compound that produced compliance as a pharmacological side effect, and the compliance was then construed as the absence of suffering. A patient who could not remember being in pain was considered, under the operational logic of the ward, equivalent to a patient who had not been in pain. The nurses who restrained them knew this was not accurate. Some said so, in letters and memoirs that constitute a quiet counter-record to the official clinical literature of the period. One account, from a nurse who worked in a twilight sleep ward in a London hospital in the 1930s, described the sounds of the ward on a busy night as unlike anything else she encountered in her career. Not because the patients were in unusual distress. They were in the distress appropriate to labour, which is considerable, but because the distress was being systematically documented as absent. The charts recorded peaceful deliveries. The ward did not sound like peaceful deliveries. The nurse did not publish her account. It survived in a family archive and was cited in a 1994 history of obstetric anaesthesia in a footnote without her name. The patient advocacy that eventually helped end twilight sleep was not dramatic. There was no single case, no landmark judgment, no famous individual whose story changed the practice. There was a gradual accumulation of women who had been through it, or watched others go through it, who declined to accept the clinical framing that the experience did not count because it was not remembered. They were correct. The practice faded. The ethical question it raised, whether suffering without memory constitutes harm, was never formally resolved in medicine and surfaces periodically in contexts that have nothing to do with childbirth. Robert Ernest House presented his truth serum findings with considerable enthusiasm at the American Medical Association meeting in 1922. The reception was mixed. Some colleagues found his evidence compelling. Others found his methodology, administering scopolamine to prisoners before trial and recording whatever they said, ethically and scientifically problematic. House was not deterred. He continued publishing, continued experimenting, and continued corresponding with law enforcement agencies that were, in varying degrees, interested in a compound that could compel honest testimony. The Texas courts that received his results were not persuaded. Neither were courts in other jurisdictions where his work was submitted. The testimony obtained under scopolamine was too internally inconsistent to be useful. Prisoners contradicted themselves across the period of intoxication, produced detailed accounts of events that could be verified to have not occurred, and in some cases provided information that was later confirmed to be genuine mixed, indistinguishably with information that was confabulated. Distinguishing between the two after the fact without independent corroboration was not possible. This is not a flaw in scopolamine as a truth serum. It is a description of what anticholinergic delirium actually produces. The CIA reached the same conclusion more expensively. MKUltra's budget across its operational years ran to millions of dollars. The scopolamine component was one of many approaches tested, alongside compounds that were already controlled substances and compounds that were newly synthesized for the program. The subjects included prisoners, psychiatric patients, military personnel, and members of the public who were administered compounds without their knowledge in what the program called field testing. Safe houses in San Francisco and New York were established specifically for this purpose. The results from scopolamine testing were documented, assessed, and filed. The assessment, unreliable. The compound produced states that could be described as compliant, but the content of what was said during those states did not meet the evidentiary standard the program required, because it could not be distinguished from confabulation. The program was not discontinued because of the scopolamine results. It continued for another decade after those assessments, testing other compounds before being shut down under political pressure in 1973 and partially disclosed to Congress in 1977. The director of the CIA ordered the destruction of MKUltra records in 1973. Approximately 20,000 documents survived in a financial records building that was searched separately and produced the partial archive that is now available. What was in the destroyed records is not known. What was in the surviving ones is specific enough to be disturbing without requiring speculation about what else there might have been. Somewhere in the American Southwest in the early 19th century, a young man was brought to a clearing at night by the elders of his community and given a drink. He had been prepared for this. The preparation had taken days, fasting, ritual, instruction, in what was coming and why. The drink was made from the root of a plant the Luceño people called toloache. He drank it. He lost consciousness. What happened in the hours that followed was, depending on who was asked, either a vision sent by the spirit world or a predictable consequence of ingesting a concentrated solution of tropane alkaloids. Both descriptions are accurate. They are not in conflict. When he woke, he was a man in the eyes of his community. He may or may not have remembered what he saw. The ceremony did not require him to remember. It required him to have gone somewhere and come back and been changed by the going. The elders knew what the plant did. That was exactly why they used it. This is the version of Datura that does not appear in emergency room records. The plant itself, Datura stramonium in North America, Datura metel across Asia and Africa, Datura inoxia in Mexico and the Southwest, grows on every continent except Antarctica. It prefers disturbed soil, roadsides, empty lots, the edges of fields, anywhere the ground has been broken and left. It produces large white or pale purple trumpet-shaped flowers that open at dusk and close by morning. It is not a jungle plant or a remote plant or a plant that requires any particular knowledge to find. It grows along fences. It grows in vacant lots in cities. In the United States, it is not a scheduled substance. The seeds are available for purchase online as a garden ornamental, which is one of several indications that drug scheduling policy is not always developed by people with a detailed knowledge of pharmacology. The dose problem is the first thing anyone who studies Datura seriously confronts, and it does not resolve. Alkaloid concentration, the amount of scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine in any given part of the plant, varies between individual plants, between different parts of the same plant, between seasons, between soil conditions, between the age of the leaves and the ripeness of the seeds. A quantity of plant material that produces mild disorientation in one specimen produces life-threatening toxicity in the specimen growing 3 feet away. There is no reliable way to know in advance. There is no standardized preparation. There is no dose. There is only the plant and what it happens to contain on the day it is used, and the person who used it finding out afterward which version they encountered. This is not a problem that ancient and indigenous cultures were unaware of. It is the reason that every traditional use of Datura that survived long enough to be recorded was surrounded by the most elaborate protective structure the culture could construct. The Toloache ceremony among the Luiseño, Chumash, and Cahuilla peoples of California was not casual. It involved experienced guides who had been through the ceremony themselves and had studied the plant across years. It involved careful preparation of the extract by people who knew the plant intimately and had developed, through generations of accumulated knowledge and accumulated loss, a working understanding of the range within which the dose was survivable. It involved darkness, ritual, the presence of people who would stay awake through the entire experience and intervene if the person's physical state became dangerous. And it was done once, in most traditions, as an initiation, not repeated, not recreational, not exploratory. Once, with everything the community knew about how to keep the person alive, and that was considered enough. The knowledge that the plant was dangerous was not incidental to the ceremony. It was part of why the ceremony existed. The danger was the point. What you learned by going somewhere that dangerous and coming back was that you had gone somewhere that dangerous and come back. The community witnessed it. The person carried it. The plant was not incidental to this. It was the vehicle. But the vehicle required the entire ceremony to be anything other than simply toxic. Datura travelled. After European contact, Datura stramonium spread across the Americas, crossed the Atlantic and established itself across Europe, Africa, and eventually globally. The plant moved. The ceremony did not. In the Ayurvedic medical tradition of India, Datura metel appears in texts going back more than 2,000 years. It was used as an anaesthetic, ground into preparations for surgical procedures, recognised as capable of producing insensibility sufficient for the knife. It was also recognised as capable of producing death, and the literature is careful about this, in the way that literature produced by people who have watched the boundary being crossed tends to be careful. Arab physicians encountered it through trade and recorded what they found. The 11th century polymath al-Biruni, who wrote on everything from astronomy to pharmacology with equal attention, documented datura in his Kitab al-Saydana, a pharmacological encyclopedia, and noted its use in Central Asia both for medicine and for purposes he described with some diplomatic restraint. In China, the physician Li Shizhen documented datura matel in his Benkao Gangmu, the great Ming dynasty compendium of natural history completed in 1596. Li Shizhen noted something that sounds like folklore and is actually an early observation about set and setting, that if a person laughed while gathering the flowers, the medicine prepared from them would cause laughter. If they wept while gathering, the medicine would cause weeping. He was not describing magic. He was describing, in the vocabulary available to him, the observation that the emotional state of the person handling the plant influenced the character of the experience it produced, an observation that modern psychopharmacology would not formally articulate for another 400 years. The use of datura in Chinese surgical anesthesia is documented from at least the 3rd century. The physician Hua Tuo is credited, in historical accounts of uncertain reliability, with developing a preparation called mafazin, hemp boiling powder, that may have included datura among its constituents. The accounts describe patients undergoing abdominal surgery under this preparation without response to pain, which is consistent with full anticholinergic delirium. Whether the patients remembered the procedure afterward is not recorded. Given the pharmacology, probably not. The European witch trial confessions covered the ground of the flying ointment in part 1, but the specific hallucinations in those confessions are worth returning to from a different angle. The women who described attending the Sabbath were not describing the kind of experience that recreational users of psychedelics typically report. They were not describing visions of light or geometric patterns or a sense of cosmic unity. They were describing social events, feasts, dancing with specific named people, conversations with neighbours, with the recently dead, with figures who behaved exactly as those figures behaved in ordinary life. They were describing the brain generating the social world it knew, populating the delirium with the people it had lost or loved or feared, and then dropping those people into a setting that was recognisable as festive and communal and real. This is the signature of anticholinergic delirium, and it is consistent across 4 centuries of documented accounts. The hallucinations are not alien. They are made of the most familiar material the brain has, the faces and voices and behaviours of the people it knows best. What datura does is not import something strange into the person's world. It generates the person's world from the inside, without the outside, and the person cannot tell. In 1994, a case was documented in an American emergency department. A man in his 30s, brought in by his wife, who had found him mid-conversation in their living room. He was sitting in a chair, speaking clearly and fluently, maintaining eye contact with a point in space approximately 3 feet in front of him. He appeared calm. He appeared entirely cogent. He was talking to his father, who had been dead for 6 years. His wife had been in the room for 20 minutes before he registered her presence at all, and when he did, he introduced her to his father without apparent awareness that anything in the introduction was unusual. His temperature was elevated. His pupils were fully dilated. His mouth was dry. His heart rate was 120 beats per minute. He had no memory when he recovered 2 days later of any of this. The investigating physicians eventually traced the exposure to a tea the man had prepared from what he believed was an herbal supplement purchased at a market. The supplement had been mislabeled. What it contained was datura. The amount was not determined with precision. It was enough. This case is not unusual in the literature. What makes it representative is the quality the wife described afterward. Not that her husband was frightened, not that he was distressed, not that he was behaving in a way that suggested he knew something was wrong. He was perfectly comfortable. He was having a good conversation with his father. From inside the experience, nothing required attention. From outside it, everything did. This is the specific unpleasantness, not the racing heart or the elevated temperature or even the 2 days of subsequent amnesia. Those are the physiological record. The unpleasantness is the one that has no physiological record, because the person experiencing it has no access to it as an experience. It is only available afterward, in the reconstruction. I was there, entirely myself in every observable way, speaking and reasoning and maintaining eye contact, and I was somewhere entirely else, and I did not know. The gap between those two things, between the appearance of presence and the total absence of it, is what puts datura in a category that very few things share. The duration makes it worse. This is not an experience that lasts an hour or 3 hours or even the 8 to 12 hours of a difficult psychedelic night. Full datura delirium lasts 24 to 72 hours. The man in the emergency department spent 2 days talking to people who were not there, attempting tasks that could not be completed, reaching for objects that did not exist, before the alkaloids cleared his system sufficiently for the world to come back. His wife spent those 2 days in the same room, watching. The experience from her side of it is also in the record. It is not described as easier. The most consistently reported single recurring feature of datura delirium is the cigarette. It appears in case reports from the 19th century and in harm reduction accounts from the 21st, with a consistency that is itself pharmacologically interesting, and which has a specific explanation rooted in how the brain generates habitual motion. A person reaches for a cigarette, lights it, smokes it, finds nothing in their hand, reaches again. The cigarette is not there. This loop does not resolve. The brain, running its most practiced motor routines in the absence of sensory verification, cycles through the action without the object, indefinitely, because the system that would notice the absence of the object is the system that is not working. The dose problem surfaces again here, at the other end of the experience. The distance between the dose that produces the man talking to his dead father delirium and the dose that produces cardiac arrhythmia and death is not large. The therapeutic window, the range within which datura does something survivable, is one of the narrowest of any psychoactive plant in use. The Toloch ceremony existed in part because communities had learned, the hard way, and over generations, where that window was and how to stay inside it. Recreational and accidental users have no such knowledge and no such community. They have the plant and what it happens to contain and whatever outcome that combination produces. Emergency physicians who have treated datura cases describe a consistent presentation. The patient appears calm, is often mid-conversation with someone not in the room, and has no insight whatsoever into their condition. Unlike patients presenting with alcohol intoxication or psychedelic crisis, who typically know something is wrong and can be oriented to the fact of their intoxication, datura patients cannot. The information required to process the fact of intoxication, that external reality is the standard against which internal experience should be checked, is precisely the information the compound has removed. You cannot tell someone in full anticholinergic delirium that they are in full anticholinergic delirium. There is no one home to receive the message. Datura is the oldest of the three. It has the longest documented history, the widest geographic distribution, the most elaborate traditional frameworks built around it, and the most extensive emergency room record. It has been used in medicine, in ritual, in poison, in warfare, and in accident. Every culture that encountered it independently arrived at the same conclusion. This plant is extraordinarily dangerous and will generate an experience indistinguishable from ordinary reality for as long as it wants to. The experience it generates lasts days. The other substance in this conversation that earns the word unpleasant does so in minutes. Not because those minutes are easier, because they are stranger, in a way that days of datura delirium, for all its particular horror, does not quite reach. Datura takes the world away and fills it with a version of itself. What comes next takes something more fundamental, the sense of being a person in a world at all, and suspends that instead. What those cases look like from the outside is present in enough accounts to constitute a pattern. A person found wandering a residential street at 2 a.m, mid-conversation, calm, several miles from their home with no memory of having travelled there. A person who spent an estimated 9 hours attempting to prepare a meal in a kitchen, reaching repeatedly for ingredients that were not on the counter, addressing family members who had been asleep for hours, and was found in the morning with the stove on, the kitchen undisturbed, and no memory of the night. A person who sent 47 text messages across a 4-hour period to various contacts. Coherent sentences, normal punctuation, nothing that would register as unusual, and remembered none of them the following day. The recipients of those messages have accounts. The sender does not. The post-experience reconstruction is its own particular quality of unpleasant, distinct from the experience itself. The person wakes up, recovered, physically depleted, often with a headache and the dry mouth and the lingering physical aftermath of 2 days of elevated heart rate, and begins to find out what happened. The evidence is not always there. Sometimes there are messages, sometimes there are objects moved, injuries without clear cause, locations reached without memory of travel. Sometimes there is very little evidence at all, and the person is left with a 2-day gap and the knowledge that they were somewhere in it, doing things, being entirely present in every observable way and encoding none of it. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent considerable intellectual energy on questions of personal identity across time, whether the person who wakes up is in any meaningful sense the same person who went to sleep, whether continuity of memory is what constitutes the continuity of a self. Datura raises a version of this question that Parfit did not specifically address. What is the status of a self that was present, functioning, and active for 2 days and recorded nothing? The man talking to his dead father was by every observable measure a person having an experience. He was not, or he was, and the experience simply does not exist in any form that the person can access. Both formulations are unsatisfying. Both are accurate. The accounts of people who have witnessed datura delirium from the outside, family members, bystanders, emergency personnel, consistently describe something that is disturbing in a way that ordinary intoxication is not. Ordinary intoxication is recognizable. The person is impaired, they know they are impaired, their behavior is degraded from their baseline in ways that are legible. Datura delirium is not legible. The person is present, articulate, socially engaged, and entirely somewhere else, and the dissonance between those two facts, the appearance of presence and the total absence of it, is what witnesses consistently identify as the thing they cannot shake. Not the content of the hallucinations, not the physical symptoms, but the specific quality of interacting with a person who is not there. This quality is not unique to accidental exposure. The harm reduction literature on intentional datura use, the accounts produced by people who sought the experience deliberately, read the available documentation, made what they considered informed preparations, and took the plant anyway, produces the same witness reports when anyone was present to witness. And the self-reports, when they exist, which is not always, describe the same retroactive strangeness, the discovery, in reconstruction, of a version of themselves that was fully operational and entirely absent. The Erowid Datura Vault contains accounts that span 3 decades. The dominant register is not horror and not mysticism. It is a kind of flat bewilderment, people describing, in the past tense, events they cannot remember and actions they apparently took and states they apparently inhabited, with the specific effectlessness of someone narrating something that happen to a person they know well but are not. The accounts that are most cited, most linked, most referenced in harm reduction communities are not the most dramatic ones. They are the ones that most accurately capture the quality of finding out, rather than experiencing. The cigarette loop, the dead relatives, the miles travelled with no memory of the road. One account, widely cited in Datura harm reduction communities for its specificity, describes a person waking from a 2-day delirium to find their apartment had been thoroughly rearranged. Furniture moved, contents of drawers emptied onto surfaces, a window open that is 2 floors up and has no apparent reason to have been opened. The person has no memory of any of it. They spend the day reconstructing unsuccessfully. What they conclude, eventually, is that whoever rearranged the apartment had a reason that made sense at the time, that the actions were purposeful, that the person doing them was not random or chaotic but was working towards something. What that something was does not survive into the memory. Only the evidence of its pursuit remains. The cigarette keeps coming back. Not as metaphor, not as a detail that one writer noticed and another borrowed. It appears in Datura case reports from the 1800s. It appears in henbane accounts from early 20th century toxicology. It appears in diphenhydramine trip reports from the 1990s and the 2000s and last week. Across substances, across centuries, across cultures with no connection to each other, a person in anticholinergic delirium reaches for a cigarette that is not there, lights it, smokes it, finds nothing in their hand, and reaches again. The loop does not resolve. This is not coincidence, and it is not because cigarettes are universally significant. It is because the brain, when deprived of the ability to verify what is real, does something precise and predictable. And the cigarette is one of the clearest windows into what that something is. This part is about the pattern, not about one drug or one century or one case. About the fact that when you remove the brain's verification layer, the hallucinations that result are not random. They follow rules, the same rules, across every anticholinergic substance ever documented, in every culture that encountered them. Spiders, shadow people, the name called by someone not present, the conversation with the dead, the task that cannot be completed because the object required for it does not exist. These are not the brain malfunctioning. They are the brain functioning exactly as it was built to function, in a context where the inputs have been removed. Understanding why they recur is understanding what the brain actually is when you take the world away. The cigarette first. The mechanism is called perseveration of motor routine, and it operates like this. Smoking a cigarette for a habitual smoker is one of the most deeply encoded behavioral sequences in the brain's motor repertoire. The sequence, reach, grasp, bring to mouth, inhale, exhale, has been performed thousands of times. It does not require conscious direction. It fires automatically, triggered by context. The feeling of a certain kind of restlessness, the end of a meal, a moment of pause. Under normal conditions, the sequence is completed, or it is interrupted by the absence of a cigarette. The hand reaches and finds nothing. The loop terminates. The brain updates. Under anticholinergic delirium, the updating mechanism is offline. The hand reaches, finds nothing. The brain does not register the finding of nothing as information that should terminate the sequence. The sequence fires again. The loop continues indefinitely, not because the person is confused about cigarettes, but because the error correction mechanism that would close the loop has been removed. This applies to any deeply practiced motor routine. People in anticholinergic delirium attempt repeatedly to use phones that are not in their hands, to drink from glasses that are on tables they are not sitting at, to put on shoes that are in another room, to complete over and over the ordinary physical actions that compose daily life, because those actions are the most automated, most deeply practiced sequences in the motor repertoire, and the mechanism that would notice they are not being completed is precisely what is not working. The cigarette is common because smoking is a high-frequency, highly practiced routine. The phone is increasingly common for the same reason. What changes across generations is the routine itself. What does not change is the loop. The spiders are different and more unsettling because they do not come from practice. Nobody learns to see spiders the way they learn to smoke a cigarette. The spider hallucination, small, dark, fast-moving, at the periphery of vision, vanishing when looked at directly, appears across anticholinergic delirium with a consistency that suggests it is generated by a different system entirely. The visual system has two distinct processing pathways that neuroscientists call, with an enthusiasm for clarity that is not always present in the field, the what pathway and the where pathway. The what pathway processes the detail, colour and identity of objects. It is what lets you recognise a face or read text. The where pathway processes location, motion, and the spatial relationships between things. The where pathway is older, faster, and more connected to the brain's threat detection systems. It is what makes you flinch at movement in peripheral vision before you have consciously identified what moved. Under anticholinergic delirium, with the brain generating its own visual content in the absence of external input, the where pathway, the older, faster, threat-oriented system, runs with less external constraint than the what pathway. It generates movement. It generates small, fast objects. It generates them at the periphery, which is where the where pathway operates most actively, and where the what pathway is least engaged. The result is the perception of small, fast, dark things moving at the edge of vision. The cultural category that most readily accommodates small, fast, dark things moving at the edge of vision is the spider. That is why it is spiders. A person who had grown up in a context where the culturally available category for peripheral threat was something else might generate something else. But spiders are nearly universal, and so are small, fast, dark things moving at the edge of vision. When the person looks directly at the spider, the where pathway's object is handed to the what pathway, which finds no actual input to process and resolves the percept to nothing. The spider vanishes. The where pathway generates another one. This is why they are always at the edge and never directly visible. The brain is producing them from one system and erasing them with another, in a loop that exactly parallels the cigarette loop but through entirely different neural machinery. The shadow people work similarly, but are not identical. Where spiders are generated by the where pathway's threat detection function at the periphery, shadow people are generated by the brain's social cognition systems, the networks that detect and process the presence of other human beings. These systems are among the most powerful and most evolutionarily ancient in the human brain. Detecting the presence of another person, particularly a large, dark, upright figure, was sufficiently important to survival that the system is calibrated to err aggressively on the side of detection. A false positive, seeing a person who is not there, is much less costly than a false negative, not seeing one who is. Under anticholinergic delirium, with external sensory input removed, these social detection systems generate figures. The figures are large, dark, and upright, because that is the template the system is calibrated to find significant. They are in peripheral vision for the same reason spiders are. The peripheral visual field is processed predominantly by the where pathway, and the where pathway is where both threat detection and social detection operate most actively. When looked at directly, the what pathway again finds no input, and the figure resolves to nothing. The social detection system generates another one. The loop continues. What this means is that shadow people, across every culture and every substance and every century of documented delirium, are not a mysterious phenomenon. They are the predictable output of a system that is very good at finding human beings and is running without the external input that would normally tell it when to stop. The shadow people are not there because the brain is broken. They are there because the brain is working. The conversations with the dead are the most humanly significant of the recurring features and operate through the most sophisticated machinery. Human social cognition does not merely detect the presence of other people, it models them. It builds internal representations of specific individuals, their likely behaviours, their speech patterns, their emotional states, their probable responses to various situations. These models are continuously updated through interaction. They are among the most detailed and most computationally expensive things the brain maintains. Under anticholinergic delirium, these models run without the external input that would normally update them. The brain, asked to generate the social world without the actual social world, does what it is built to do. It populates the space with the people it knows best, running their models on internal data alone. Family members, close friends, people who have died, whose models are no longer being updated by new interaction, but remain present in the brain's social architecture, intact and fully operational. The conversations feel real because they are generated by the same neural machinery that generates real conversations. The mother who has been dead for 10 years answers in the way she would have answered. The brother who lives in another country offers advice in the voice and cadence that the brain has modelled across decades of interaction. The brain cannot tell that these are models running without external input rather than actual people, because the verification system that would make that distinction is the system that has been removed. This is why witch trial confessions consistently describe encounters with specific named people at the Sabbath. This is why the Salem afflicted described being pinched and bitten by neighbours they could name. This is why the man in the 1994 emergency case was talking to his father, not to a stranger. The brain does not generate random people. It generates the people it knows. It generates them accurately enough that the conversation proceeds, that the interaction feels entirely ordinary, that nothing in the experience flags itself as unusual. The only thing missing is the people themselves. The name called by someone not present operates through a parallel but simpler system, the auditory equivalent of the social detection networks. The human auditory system is specifically calibrated through something researchers call the cocktail party effect, to detect its own name in ambient sound. This detection is automatic, preconscious, and extraordinarily reliable. A person can be in a room full of conversation and not consciously tracking any of it, and their own name, spoken across the room, will pull their attention immediately. That circuit is always listening. Under anticholinergic delirium, with the auditory cortex generating its own content in the absence of external sound, the name detection circuit fires. It finds its own name because it is generating the signal it is calibrated to find. The name is heard clearly, in a voice that often belongs to a known person, called from a direction that the where pathway has assigned. The person turns, no one is there, it fires again. What all of this means, and this is the observation that turns a list of unpleasant drug experiences into something with a genuine argument, is that the hallucinations of anticholinergic delirium are not noise. They are the brain's signal. They are what the brain produces when you take away everything external and let it run on internal data alone. The motor routines most deeply practiced, the threat detection systems most evolutionarily ancient, the social models most carefully maintained, the name recognition systems most reliably calibrated. These are not the brain's failures. They are its highest priorities, running without correction. The same pattern holds across datura and diphenhydramine and henbane and scopolamine and every other anticholinergic substance in the historical and clinical record, because the mechanism is the same. Block the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors sufficiently, remove the brain's access to sensory verification, and the same systems generate the same content. Spiders at the edge of vision, shadow figures that vanish when confronted, the dead talking, the name called, the cigarette reaching. Salvia produces none of this, not because salvia is gentler, it is not in any meaningful sense of the word, but because it does not work on acetylcholine receptors at all. It works on a different system, through a different door, and what comes through that door is something for which the above framework provides no preparation. The anticholinergic hallucinations are the brain's own content, familiar people, familiar routines, the known world generated from inside. What salvia produces is not the brain's content, it is closer to the absence of the brain's categories altogether, including, in a significant proportion of accounts, the category of being a brain. The historical record looks different through this framework. The witch trial confessions that described attendance at the Sabbath, dancing with specific neighbours, feasting with people who were present in the village, encountering the recently dead in states of apparent health, were not inventions extracted under torture, though some of them were that too. Many were descriptions of genuine experience, filtered through the only explanatory framework available, diabolism. The brain had generated a social event, populated with the known and the dead, in the vivid and indistinguishable from reality mode that anticholinergic delirium produces. The inquisitors took that description and applied their framework. The woman took that description and applied hers. The experience was real. The explanation for it was wrong. The Salem accounts describe something slightly different. Not the Sabbath exactly, but presences, entities, sensations of being touched or bitten by people who were not there. The afflicted girls described specific neighbours reaching through windows, pinching them from across the room, tormenting them from a distance. These are the social detection systems generating threat-coded figures in a community that was already primed to see exactly that kind of threat. The models the brain had built of the community's most feared members, the accused, the already suspected, the socially marginal, were the models the delirium populated the space with. The brain generated the people it had been told to fear. The community took this as evidence that those people were guilty. This is the specific cruelty of anticholinergic delirium as a historical force. It generates testimony. It generates vivid, detailed, specific, emotionally coherent accounts of events that did not happen, delivered by people who experienced those events as fully real, in a culture with no framework for understanding chemically induced psychosis. The confessions were not lies. They were reports. What they reported was the output of a deranged brain, which is not the same as the events described, and is not the same as a lie, and produced the same result as both. The pattern of recurring hallucinations across cultures and centuries is, from one angle, a pharmacological curiosity. From another angle, it is an explanation for a significant portion of recorded human history. The dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518, in which several hundred people danced uncontrollably in the streets until some of them died, is explained by ergot, a different compound, a different mechanism, but one that produces compulsive motor behaviour through the same general principle of removing the brain's access to its own error correction. The oracle at Delphi, whose pronouncements shaped the political decisions of the ancient Greek world, was sitting above a geological fault that vented ethylene gas, a dissociative compound that produces altered states through a distinct mechanism, but the same loss of external reality as the reference frame for experience. The chemistry differs. The principle is the same. Remove the brain's access to the external world, and the internal world expands to fill the space in ways that are consistent enough to be predictable and strange enough to require explanation. And the explanations cultures have generated for them have shaped politics, religion, law, and recorded history across 5,000 years of documentation. The brain generating its own content in the absence of verification is not a modern problem with a modern solution. It is a property of the brain that has been producing documented consequences since before writing existed to document them. What has changed is the availability of a framework for understanding what is happening, a framework that is several hundred years old in outline and several decades old in the specific mechanistic detail that explains the cigarette loop and the spiders and the shadow people and the voice calling the name. What has not changed is the experience itself. The man in the 1994 emergency room talking to his dead father, was having an experience that the women tried in Salem in 1692, and the dancers in Strasbourg in 1518, and the initiates of the Toloash ceremony in California across centuries of practice, would each have recognized something of, despite the centuries and the cultures and the completely different substances involved, the brain generating the social world it knows, in the absence of the actual social world, the familiar people in the wrong place, entirely present, saying the expected things. This consistency is either comforting or deeply unsettling, depending on what you conclude from it. What it says about the brain is that the social world it constructs from external input is not so different from the social world it constructs without it. The people are the same, the conversations are the same, the emotional texture is the same. The only difference is whether anyone else is there, and the brain, without its verification system, cannot answer that question. Benadryl has been in the medicine cabinet since 1943. It sits between the aspirin and the cough syrup, which is where it belongs, and where it has been for 80 years, which is part of what makes it strange. Diphenhydramine, sold under the name Benadryl and 100 generic equivalents, is the first-generation antihistamine, the one for hay fever and hives and the kind of allergic reaction that makes the eyes swell. It is the one that makes you drowsy. Your parents gave it to you. You've probably taken it. It is available in every pharmacy in the developed world without a prescription, which is accurate information, and also, depending on the dose, wildly incomplete. At 25 to 50 milligrams, the dose on the box, the dose your parents gave you, diphenhydramine is an antihistamine with sedative properties. Unremarkable, useful, safe in the way that over-the-counter medications are supposed to be safe. At 700 milligrams, 28 standard tablets, it produces full anticholinergic delirium. The spiders, the shadow people, the conversations with the absent. Running in a suburban bedroom at 3 a.m, with the same content as a datura poisoning in a 17th century witch trial. The gap between those two doses sounds large. In absolute terms, it is not. The gap between the delirium dose and the dose at which cardiac arrhythmia becomes the primary event is smaller still. This is the part of the pharmacology that the pink box does not mention, and the challenge videos did not include. George Reveshel was a graduate student at the University of Cincinnati in 1943 when he synthesized the compound that would become Benadryl. He was 26 years old, working on anticonvulsant research, and produced diphenhydramine as a side discovery, a compound that turned out to be less interesting for seizures than for allergies. Park Davis licensed it. The FDA approved it. Within a few years, it was the first commercially available antihistamine in the United States. Reveshel received a royalty that made him wealthy, which he described in later interviews as somewhat surprising given that he had not been trying to do what he had done. The drowsiness that made diphenhydramine a slightly inconvenient antihistamine was the first indication that the compound was doing something beyond blocking histamine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier readily, more readily than later antihistamines would be designed to do, and inside the brain it does two things simultaneously. It blocks H1 histamine receptors, which produces the antihistamine effect and contributes to the sedation, and it blocks muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, which is the same action that produces delirium in datura, henbane, and scopolamine. At therapeutic doses, the second effect is a side effect: dry mouth, mild sedation, the slight cognitive fog that makes operating heavy machinery inadvisable. At high doses, it is the main event. The pharmacology was understood early. The clinical literature documenting high-dose diphenhydramine toxicity begins appearing in the 1960s. Case reports from emergency departments, poisoning centre logs, toxicology reviews. The pattern was consistent. The compound that prevented sneezing, at sufficient overdose, produced the same presentation as any other anticholinergic poisoning: hot, dry, flushed, dilated pupils, racing heart, confusion grading into delirium. The mnemonic applied. The treatment was the same. What made diphenhydramine unusual in this context was the accessibility. Datura grows in fields and requires knowledge to prepare. Scopolamine is prescription. Henbane is not sold in pharmacies. Diphenhydramine is in a pink box between the aspirin and the cough syrup, which means the barrier between ordinary over-the-counter medication and full anticholinergic delirium is 27 additional tablets and a bad decision. The online documentation of high-dose diphenhydramine use begins appearing in the late 1990s on Erowid, the harm reduction archive that was by then accumulating first-hand accounts of drug experiences across the full spectrum of what human beings were willing to ingest. The DPH Vault, the section dedicated to diphenhydramine, grew slowly at first, then quickly, and accumulated over the following decades into one of the most consistent bodies of first-hand pharmacological testimony in the harm reduction literature. Consistent not because the accounts agree on every detail, but because they agree on the ones that matter. The setting is almost always a bedroom. This is partly practical. Diphenhydramine is something people take at home, at night, often with the intention of sleeping and then finding instead that something else is happening, and partly a function of what the compound does to the emotional register of the space. A familiar room becomes wrong, not threatening in the way an unfamiliar place might be threatening, but wrong in the specific way that the familiar made wrong always is. The dimension seems slightly off. The lighting, even in darkness, seems slightly incorrect. The room is the room, and also not quite the room, and the person in it cannot identify what has changed. The shadow people arrive in peripheral vision. This has been explained, the wear pathway generating threat detection templates in the absence of external input, the what pathway erasing them when looked at directly. Knowing the mechanism does not make them less present. At 3 a.m, in a bedroom that is slightly wrong, the dark figures that appear at the edge of vision and vanish when confronted are not experienced as a pharmacological curiosity. They are experienced as presences. The person in the room knows, at whatever level of metacognition is still available, that these figures are produced by a compound they took. They know this. The figures are still there. The music is one of the features that distinguishes diphenhydramine delirium from the Datura accounts with some consistency. Users report hearing music, specific, identifiable, sometimes music they know, and sometimes music that does not appear to exist outside the recording, with enough clarity and detail to follow a melody. The auditory cortex generating content without input produces, for a significant proportion of DPH users, something organized enough to be recognizable as music. Some accounts describe it as beautiful. These are among the minority of positive notes in the DPH literature, and they are typically followed by a description of everything else. The phone rings with no one on the line. This has been explained. The name detection circuit generalized to other expected auditory signals. The conversation begins with someone who is not in the room. This has been explained. But the explanation for why these things happen does not diminish them as experiences, and the DPH literature is largely written by people who came to the experience after reading the explanation and found that the reading had not prepared them for the reality of it in practice. The dysphoric quality is the feature that most consistently separates DPH from every other substance in this category. Datura delirium is reported as neutral. The person having it typically does not know anything is wrong, which is the source of its particular horror. DPH delirium is reported as having a particular emotional texture that precedes any frightening content. The mood is wrong before anything frightening happens. Anxious, heavy, oppressive. A quality that users struggle to describe precisely because it is not in response to anything. It is not fear of the shadow people. It precedes the shadow people. It is the emotional register of a brain that has lost access to its own verification system and is, at some level below conscious awareness, aware of this. This quality is difficult to explain pharmacologically and has not been fully explained. The sigma receptor activity of diphenhydramine, a property not shared by plant-derived anticholinergics, may contribute. The pattern of receptor occupancy may produce a dysphoric baseline that other anticholinergic compounds do not. What is clear from the literature is that the DPH experience is not neutral hallucination with an unpleasant edge. The unpleasantness is structural. It is in the baseline. The hangover is its own chapter. Diphenhydramine has a half-life of approximately 8 hours, which means that following a high-dose session, significant quantities of the compound remain in the system for a day or more after the delirium resolves. The hangover is not the mild residual grogginess of a sedative the morning after. It is described, across hundreds of accounts, as crushing, a physical and cognitive heaviness that makes ordinary function difficult, combined with a mood state that several accounts describe as the worst they have felt outside of clinical depression. This persists for 1 to 3 days. It lasts 8 to 12 hours. The aftermath lasts 2 to 3 times as long. The Erowid DPH vault, accumulated across more than 2 decades, contains thousands of accounts. The modal note, the tone that appears most frequently, most clearly, most unreservedly, is never again. The cohort of people who try high-dose diphenhydramine and return to it is, by every measure available from harm reduction documentation, extremely small. This is not a drug that produces the kind of thing people seek to recreate. It produces the kind of thing people spend some time processing and then describe in writing, apparently on the theory that warning others is the only constructive thing available. This literature existed. It was extensive. It was specific. It was detailed about the dose at which the experience began and the dose at which the experience became medically dangerous, and it was freely available online. It was not visible to the teenagers who opened TikTok in the summer of 2020 and encountered the Benadryl challenge. The challenge was simple. Take enough Benadryl to hallucinate, film it, post the video. The pharmacology of this is the pharmacology described above. The dose required to produce filmable hallucination is the dose at which cardiac arrhythmia becomes a serious risk. There is not much space between interesting video and emergency room, and the gap between emergency room and morgue is smaller still. This was documented. It was documented in the clinical literature, in the toxicology literature, and in the harm reduction literature. None of that documentation was in the feed. The first documented hospitalization linked to the challenge appeared in the summer of 2020. More followed. In August of that year, a 15-year-old in Oklahoma City died. The family described her as having seen the challenge on TikTok, attempted it at home, and been found unresponsive. Her name was Rebecca. She was 15 years old. 2 13-year-old girls in Texas were hospitalized in separate incidents around the same period. There were others, not all of them named in public reporting. The FDA issued a formal safety communication in September of 2020, addressed to parents and caregivers, warning that high doses of diphenhydramine could lead to serious heart problems, seizure, coma, or death, and asking them to keep the medication secured. Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Benadryl, issued a statement. TikTok removed videos associated with the challenge. The platform acted after the deaths, not before. The sequence. Challenge appears, hospitalizations accumulate, deaths occur, regulatory warning issued, platform acts, took several months. The deaths occurred in the middle of that sequence, not at the end of it. The unresolvable problem is that diphenhydramine cannot be meaningfully restricted without removing it from the people who need it for allergies, for sleep, for motion sickness, for the ordinary over-the-counter purposes for which 80 years of pharmaceutical distribution have established it as safe. The dose that prevents sneezing and the dose that kills are separated by a quantity, not by kind, and there is no regulatory instrument that changes a quantity while leaving a kind intact. The pink box will remain between the aspirin and the cough syrup. That is where it belongs. That is also the problem. What makes Benadryl the strangest entry in this conversation is not the danger, though the danger is real and the deaths are specific and named. It is the setting. Datura takes the person somewhere ancient and strange, and does its work in a context that has no reference point in ordinary life. Benadryl keeps the person exactly where they are. The bedroom is the bedroom. The medicine cabinet is the medicine cabinet. The shadows at the edge of vision are in a room that the person has slept in for years. The familiarity is the horror. Modernity did not protect anyone from this. It gave the mechanism a pink box and a place on a shelf next to the aspirin, and then it put the shelf in a bedroom at 3 a.m, and then it gave the bedroom a TikTok account. The question of why people take it at all, given the literature, is not rhetorical. It has answers. The first is accessibility. Diphenhydramine requires no connection, no supplier, no knowledge of where to source an unusual compound. It is in the medicine cabinet. It was already there. The second is the specific way internet documentation functions as both warning and dare. The Erowid DPH vault is explicit about how unpleasant the experience is. It is also explicit about what the experience involves. The shadow people, the music, the figures at the edge of vision, the 6 hours of something unlike anything else available through any other means. For a subset of people, the description of the experience is the draw. The fact that it is difficult is not a deterrent. For this cohort, it is the specification. There is a documented pattern in the harm reduction literature that researchers have described as phenonautics, the deliberate seeking of extreme, difficult or confrontational altered states for their own sake, not for pleasure or revelation but for the confrontation itself. The people who try datura knowing what it is, who take DPH after reading the vault, who seek out salvia specifically because of what the accounts describe, these are not people who missed the warnings. They read the warnings and made a different calculation. Whether this is pathological or simply unusual is a question the harm reduction community has not resolved, partly because the same impulse, directed at extreme sports or fasting or cold water immersion, produces no particular clinical concern. The online DPH community that predated TikTok by more than a decade had developed, through the accumulation of accounts, something that functioned as harm reduction, even though many of the accounts it contained described harm. The accounts specified what doses produced what effects. They described the onset and duration. They described the cardiac risk explicitly. They described the hangover in enough detail that a person reading them would have a reasonably accurate prediction of the following 3 days. The community was not promoting DPH use. It was documenting it, and the documentation functioned in the way that explicit documentation of difficult experiences often does, as a significant deterrent for the people who read it carefully, and a significant accelerant for the people who read only the parts about the shadow people. The TikTok challenge bypassed this entirely. The videos that circulated in the summer of 2020 were not drawn from the DPH harm reduction community or from any tradition of careful documentation. They were challenge videos, the format that TikTok's algorithm was optimized to spread, in which participation is the point and the content is secondary to the act of filming oneself participating. The people who watched them were not reading the Erowid DPH vault. They were watching 15-second clips of other teenagers doing something unusual, and the format invited participation without providing context. The FDA communication that followed the deaths described diphenhydramine at high doses as capable of causing serious heart problems, seizures, coma, or death, and noted that these risks were not mitigated by the fact that the compound was available without prescription. This was accurate and necessary and arrived after Rebecca in Oklahoma City had already died. The FDA does not monitor TikTok in real time. It responds to reports. The reports take time. The algorithm does not wait for the reports. Johnson & Johnson's response included the statement that the company was working with TikTok to remove dangerous content related to the challenge. The statement was issued approximately 2 months after the first documented hospitalizations. Johnson & Johnson manufactures Benadryl and has for decades. The compound's safety profile at therapeutic doses is not in question. The compound's safety profile at 28 tablets is also not in question, and has not been in question since the first high-dose case reports appeared in the 1960s. The 60 years between those case reports and the TikTok challenge were not a period in which the pharmacology changed. What changed was distribution. Not of the compound, it was always in the medicine cabinet, but of the knowledge that the compound, at sufficient dose, produce something filmable. That knowledge had been in the harm reduction literature for 20 years. It entered the general population via TikTok in the summer of 2020, stripped of context, formatted as entertainment, and optimized by an algorithm that did not distinguish between a recipe video and a challenge that could produce cardiac arrest. The 3-day hangover that follows a high-dose DPH experience has a texture that the accounts describe in enough detail to constitute a reasonably consistent portrait. The first day, physical heaviness, cognitive fog dense enough to make reading difficult, a mood state that several accounts describe as among the lowest they have experienced without a specific cause. Not grief, not anxiety, a flat, grey, motivationless state that resists explanation because it has no object. The second day, lighter, but the fog persists and the mood remains below baseline. The third day, returning to normal, though some accounts describe a residual flatness that extends into a fourth day or fifth. It lasts one night. The aftermath lasts a week. This is what the challenge videos did not show. They showed the experience, or rather, they showed the portions of the experience that were filmable, which is a particular subset. A person mid-conversation with someone not in the room does not make a coherent video. A person reaching repeatedly for a cigarette that is not there does not make a compelling 15-second clip. What made it to TikTok was the legible strangeness, the laughter, the confusion, the obviously altered behaviour that reads as funny from outside and as not from inside. The 3 days afterward were not filmed, they were experienced alone, in the same bedroom, in the same medicine cabinet's shadow. At some point, the obvious question surfaces. If these experiences are this consistently unpleasant, if the Datura accounts read like accident reports, if the Benadryl hangover lasts 3 days, if salvia leaves people staring at the ceiling trying to reconstruct what a person is, why would anyone choose this? The question is not rhetorical. It deserves a real answer. The answer is not stupidity. Ignorance plays a role in some cases. The mislabeled supplement, the salad that turned out to contain Jimson weed, the teenager who saw a challenge on TikTok and did not read the pharmacology. But the people who seek out these substances deliberately, who read the documentation and choose them anyway, are not making a mistake. They are making a calculation. Understanding that calculation is understanding something genuine about the human relationship with altered consciousness. A relationship that predates written history and shows no sign of concluding. The impulse toward altered consciousness is not modern, not Western, not pathological, and not rare. Every documented human culture has developed methods for producing it: fermented beverages, fasting, rhythmic movement, breathwork, heat, cold, sleep deprivation, and plant medicines from every continent. The methods are different. The impulse is consistent. What people are seeking when they seek altered consciousness varies. Pleasure, insight, escape, spiritual experience, the simple curiosity of knowing what their own brain looks like from a different angle. But the seeking itself appears to be a property of the species rather than a deviation from it. Deliriants occupy the extreme end of this spectrum. The people who seek them out are doing something different in degree from the person who has a glass of wine to change how the evening feels, but not necessarily different in kind. The question is what draws someone specifically to the extreme end. What makes a person read the Datura Vault, the accident reports, the rearranged apartments, the 2 days of talking to the dead, and decide to acquire the seeds? Several things, operating in different people in different combinations. Accessibility is the most straightforward. Datura is a weed, Benadryl is in the medicine cabinet, and salvia was, for most of the period of its Western use, entirely legal and available online. For people who want to alter their consciousness and lack access to more conventional means, the threshold of availability is itself a draw. The compound is there. The question is only whether to use it. Curiosity about the extreme is another. The harm reduction literature on deliriants is, paradoxically, both the most effective deterrent to their use and the most effective advertisement. It is specific about what happens. The specificity, the shadow people, the conversations with the dead, the 6 minutes of ceasing to be a person, produces, in some readers, not the deterrence intended, but its opposite. The documentation describes something unlike any other available experience. For people who have explored much of the available spectrum and are looking for the edge of it, the consistency of the horror is itself a kind of recommendation. The mystical framing, largely imported from Castaneda and from broader cultural associations between plant medicines and spiritual insight, has sent people to Datura who are looking for transformation and found something else. This gap between the promised experience and the delivered one accounts for a significant proportion of the emergency cases in the 1970s and 80s, when Castaneda's books were fresh and the counterculture was still searching the plant world for a door that opened somewhere worthwhile. The door Datura opens is real. Where it opens to is not what anyone promised. Salvia attracts a different cohort from Datura or Benadryl. The people who seek salvia out specifically, who research it, who approach it with some preparation, who choose the smoked route and the short duration deliberately, are often drawn by the mechanism itself, the kappa opioid system, the reports of ceasing to be a person for 6 minutes, the accounts of becoming objects, of geometry replacing narrative, of the conveyor belt. This is not a promise of pleasure. It is a promise of strangeness at a depth that nothing else reaches. The people who find this appealing are, by definition, a small subset, but they exist, and the accounts they produce are the most philosophically precise in the harm reduction literature. People trying seriously to describe what the absence of the self-concept feels like, from the position of someone who briefly lacked it and has since recovered the capacity for description. The honest answer to why anyone takes Deliriants across the full population of people who have done so is, for the same reason people have always sought out the edges of consciousness, because the edges are there, because the brain is the most complex object in the known universe, and most people spend their entire lives in a narrow band of its possible states. Because curiosity is a human constant, and these substances are, in their particular way, among the most honest available answers to the question of what else the brain can do. The answers they provide are not pleasant. They are not illuminating for the most part. They are not by any conventional measure worth it, but they are genuine. The brain under Datura is the brain without its verification system. The brain under DPH is the brain generating the familiar world from inside a suburban bedroom. The brain under Salvia is the brain without the concept of being a brain. These are real states. They have been sought, experienced, survived, and documented across the full span of human history. The fact that they are unpleasant does not make them less real. What comes next is the strangest of the three. Salvia divinorum is the stranger substance in this story, not because it is the most dangerous. It is probably the least, in physical terms, not because it lasts the longest. It lasts 6 minutes. Because of what it does with those 6 minutes, which is something that Datura and Benadryl, for all their particular horrors, do not do. They replace reality. Salvia removes the equipment you use to process it. The person sits down. They have read the literature. They know what is going to happen, or they think they do, which amounts to roughly the same thing because that literature, however detailed, has a consistent limitation. It is written by people who have come back, using the vocabulary that the returned person has access to describe something that happened to a version of themselves who briefly did not have access to any vocabulary at all. Reading about Salvia is reading a translation of a translation. The original is not in English. It may not be in language. They light the pipe anyway. Salvia divinorum is a sage, a member of the mint family, native to a small and specific region, the Sierra Mazateca, a mountainous area of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, at elevations above 1,500 meters, where the cloud forest produces the cool, humid, shaded conditions the plant requires. It does not grow wild outside this region. It does not produce seeds that germinate reliably. It propagates through cuttings, which means that essentially every salvia plant in cultivation outside the Sierra Mazateca is a cutting of a cutting of a cutting of a plant that was originally brought out of those mountains by someone who had a reason to bring it. The Mazatec curanderas, the healers, almost always women, who are the keepers of the plant's traditional use, had those reasons. Salvia divinorum in Mazatec practice is a medicine and a divinatory tool. It is consumed orally in large quantities, either by chewing fresh leaves and holding them against the mucous membranes of the mouth, or by drinking a pressed juice of the leaves. The oral route produces something that begins within 15 minutes, peaks slowly, and resolves over 1 to 2 hours. The person lies down. The room is dark. The curandera stays present throughout, singing, guiding, monitoring. The encounter in this context is not short, not violent in its onset, and not done alone. This is not the salvia that entered Western drug culture. In the early 1990s, the ethnobotanist Daniel Siebert began distributing dried salvia leaves and concentrated extracts, particularly the standardized extract preparations that allowed for more predictable dosing, and publishing documentation of the plant's effects. What he described was consistent with what the Mazatec tradition had always known, a profoundly disorienting and transformative compound with genuine medicinal and contemplative potential in appropriate contexts. What happened next was that the internet existed, which meant that the documentation spread without the context, and the dried leaf and extract could be ordered by anyone who wanted them. The smoked route was not traditional. Smoking concentrates the active compound, salvinorin A, and delivers it to the brain with a speed that the oral route does not approach. What takes an hour to develop when chewed happens, when smoked, in the time between inhalation and exhalation. The onset is not gradual. It is immediate. The person draws on the pipe and the experience begins before the pipe is set down. Salvinorin A is, by weight, the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogen known. This is not a claim about how dramatic or how unpleasant it is. It is a pharmacological statement about the quantity required to produce an effect. The effective dose is measured in micrograms. What makes it unusual in the pharmacological landscape is not just the potency, but the mechanism. Salvinorin A does not act on serotonin receptors, which are the target of every classical psychedelic from psilocybin to lysergic acid diethylamide. It does not act on acetylcholine receptors, which are the target of everything covered in parts 2 through 5. It acts selectively on kappa opioid receptors, a receptor system that is involved in perception of reality, sense of bodily existence, and the feeling of being located in space and time. The kappa opioid system is also the system that, when activated by endogenous compounds in states of extreme stress or pain, produces dysphoria, dissociation, and the sensation of unreality. Salvinorin A activates it through a different door, at a different intensity, for a duration of approximately 6 minutes. What happens in those 6 minutes has been described by thousands of people across several decades of English language harm reduction documentation, and the descriptions share a structure that is more consistent than descriptions of almost any other altered state, which is notable, because the content of the experiences is often completely different from one person to the next. What is consistent is the quality, not the content, the category, not the specific content within it. The first thing that goes, in most reports, is location. Not in the datura sense, not the loss of ability to verify where you are, which is a failure of comparison between internal and external information. Something more fundamental. The category of being located somewhere at all ceases to exist as an option. The person is no longer in a room, not because the room has been replaced by something else, but because the concept of being in a room requires a framework of spatial existence that is no longer running. Along with this goes the concept of being a person, not the loss of the sense of self in the way that meditation traditions or psychedelic accounts describe ego dissolution, not a merging with the universe or an expansion of identity. Something more basic, the concept that there is a self to be located in space, that something is happening to someone, that there is a someone for it to happen to. This concept becomes temporarily unavailable. Something continues. Something is experiencing it. But the category of that something as a person with a history and a body and a name is not accessible. The reports of what fills this space, what it is like without location and without personhood, are necessarily imprecise, because the precision required to describe them is a property of the conceptual apparatus that has been suspended. But they share a quality of imprecision, geometric structures, entities that are purposeful and impersonal, and not human in any recognizable sense. The sensation of being pulled through layers of something, the conveyor belt, that many accounts describe as the dominant quality of the experience. The sense of processes happening that are not for the person and have not been explained to the person, in which the person is nonetheless participating. The sensation of becoming an object is among the most commonly reported and most difficult to convey. A significant proportion of reports include a period in which the person experiences what it is like to be a specific inanimate thing: a door hinge, a book spine, a zipper, a corner of a room. Not metaphorically. It is the state of being that object, of having the spatial existence and the functional identity of that object, without being a person who is imagining being that object. There is no person present to do the imagining. The object is what is present. The laughter is involuntary. This is reported consistently enough to be considered a characteristic feature, not laughter that the person produces in response to something funny, but laughter that the body produces as a social signal in the complete absence of any social context. The person is not amused. The person, in the full sense, is not present. The laughter happens anyway. Observers of these 6 minutes, and most reports include the presence of at least one other person, if only because the incomprehensibility of what is happening makes it difficult to manage alone, describe the laughter as one of the more unsettling features to witness, not because it sounds distressed, because it sounds normal, and nothing else about what is happening is normal. Re-entry is its own chapter. 6 minutes after the pipe was set down, the person is sober. Not gradually recovering, sober in a way that psychedelic experiences which taper over hours do not produce. The room is the room, the body is the body, the vocabulary returns, and the first task is the same task that every salvia user describes encountering at the same moment, the attempt to reconstruct, using the reassembled conceptual apparatus, what just happened to a version of themselves that did not have that apparatus. It is not possible to do this completely. What is possible is to notice the edges of the gap, the places where the sober brain reaches for what was experienced and finds something that does not translate. The duration that the experience lasts and the duration that it takes to process are not the same. The 6 minutes are over in 6 minutes. The processing takes longer. Some testimony describes it continuing for days, not the 6 minutes themselves, which are gone, but the encounter with the edges of what was experienced, the recurring attempt to process something that the sober mind does not have categories for. This is why the salvia literature is the most philosophically serious of the three. The datura literature is mostly accident reports. The DPH literature is mostly cautionary testimony. The salvia literature includes a significant proportion of accounts that are attempts, careful and often lengthy, to think about what it means that the brain has a condition in which the concept of personhood is suspended, what that implies about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between the self and the brain that generates it, about what is actually happening when a person experiences anything at all. These are not questions that the encounters answer. They are questions that the experiences make unavoidable. The legal situation is a pharmacological paradox. Salvia remains legal in the majority of United States jurisdictions, and in most countries outside a handful that have specifically added it to controlled substance lists: the United Kingdom, Australia, and several others. The reason it has not been more broadly scheduled is partly that it was not on regulatory radars when existing frameworks were established, and partly that it has proven such a reliable deterrent to repeated use that abuse rates have remained low enough not to generate the public health pressure that typically drives scheduling decisions. The compound that produces one of the most disorienting states available to a human brain is legal in most places, partly because it is so reliably unpleasant that most people try it once and do not try it again. This is the specific quality that makes salvia the strangest of the three rather than the most frightening or the most familiar. Datura's unpleasantness is in the aftermath, in the discovery when the brain comes back of what happened while it was somewhere else. Benadryl's unpleasantness is in the setting, in the familiarity of the bedroom made wrong, the medicine cabinet as the source. Salvia's unpleasantness is harder to locate because the person who would locate it was not present for the relevant period. What they have is the memory of having been in a state in which the ordinary categories of experience were suspended, in which being a person in a room having thoughts was not operative as a description of what was happening. The unpleasantness is not in the 6 minutes, it is in the re-entry. It is in the moment of looking back at those 6 minutes from the position of having all the categories restored, and finding that the position of having all the categories restored does not allow you to see clearly into the place where they were absent. The pipe has been set down for 6 minutes. The room is the room again. Somewhere in Oaxaca, in the cloud forests above 1,500 meters, the plant is still growing. It has been there for longer than the word salvia existed. The curanderos who have tended it across generations knew something about it that the harm reduction literature has spent 30 years trying to articulate, that it is not a recreational substance, that it requires a context, and that the context it requires is one that takes seriously the possibility that what the plant does is not produce an experience of unreality, but reveal something about the nature of reality that the ordinary waking brain, with all its categories intact, is constitutionally unable to see. Whether that is true is a different question from whether the experience is unpleasant. It can be both. The YouTube era of salvia, roughly 2006 through 2012, produced a body of video documentation that is unlike anything else in the history of drug experience. People filmed themselves or were filmed by friends during the 6 minutes. The videos are widely available and widely watched. They are not alarming in the way that overdose footage is alarming. They are alarming in a different way which is harder to name. The person in the video is present in the room. They are moving, making sounds, sometimes speaking. Occasionally they laugh. They interact with the environment in ways that are not random. There is a quality of purpose to the movements, even when the purpose is unidentifiable from outside. What is absent, and what the camera captures without being able to name, is any quality of normal social presence. The person is not responding to the people around them. They are not responding to the camera. They are in the room, and entirely elsewhere, in a way that the camera documents without being able to explain, and that the person will not be able to explain afterward, because the apparatus required for explanation was not running during the filming. The videos function, in the harm reduction community, as the most accurate available documentation of the external presentation of a salvia experience, more accurate than written testimony, because written accounts are produced by the returned person using restored vocabulary, while the videos were recorded during the experience itself. They show what a salvia experience looks like from outside. They do not show what it feels like from inside, which is the question the written testimony is trying to answer, and consistently failing to answer completely. Daniel Siebert, who distributed the plant widely from the early 1990s onward, also produced the most comprehensive early English language documentation of salvinorin-A's effects. His documentation was careful, scientifically grounded and explicit about the ceremonial context that the Mazatec tradition surrounded the plant with. He was not promoting recreational use. He was documenting a compound that he believed had genuine significance, and that was being badly served by the absence of accurate information in Western pharmacological literature. The work he produced and the access he enabled resulted, in the early 2000s, in salvia becoming available to anyone with an internet connection and approximately $20. The ban wave followed. Delaware was the first United States state to schedule salvia in 2003. Others followed, Louisiana, Missouri, Tennessee, and eventually more than half of American states added it to controlled substance lists over the following decade. The federal government did not schedule it. The Drug Enforcement Administration evaluated it several times, concluded each time that the abuse potential did not meet the threshold required for scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act, and declined to act. The pattern of state-level bans driven by press coverage rather than public health data, and federal inaction driven by the pharmacology, is itself a small study in how drug policy is made. The press coverage that drove the state bans was largely produced by the YouTube videos. Legislators and journalists watched the videos, observed that the people in them were behaving in incomprehensible ways in response to a legal substance available online, and concluded that something should be done about this. The conclusion was not wrong. The substance was producing genuinely unusual states in people who often had no preparation and no guide. The conclusions were not always based on an accurate understanding of the pharmacology. Several of the state legislative records show a confusion between salvia and cannabis that suggests the plant's common name, salvia, was doing more work than the pharmacological record. The Mazatec tradition has continued throughout this period, largely unaffected by Western regulatory attention. The curanderas continue to use the plant in healing ceremonies. The oral root, the darkness, the singing, the presence of the healer. The entire ceremonial context remains intact in the communities where it originated. What Western use exported was the smoked root and the absence of all context. What it did not export was the understanding that the context was not ceremonial decoration. It was the technology for managing what the plant actually does. The accounts of people who have used salvia in ceremonial contexts with Mazatec healers, and who have also used the smoked extract alone in a bedroom, describe what feel like different experiences. The phenomenology, the geometric entities, the conveyor belt, the loss of personhood, appears in both. The quality of the encounter is described as fundamentally different. This is consistent with what is known about the role of set and setting in shaping the character of any profound altered state. It is also consistent with the possibility that the curanderos know something about this plant that 30 years of Western harm reduction documentation has not yet fully articulated. What they know, or what the tradition has accumulated across generations of use, is that the plant goes somewhere that the ordinary mind does not go, and that going there without preparation, without guidance, and without a framework for what to do with what you find there, is how you end up with a YouTube video and 3 days of processing and a feeling that cannot be quite named. Everything in this story has been a version of the same event, the brain losing its grip on what is real, and whatever the culture is ready rushing in to fill the space. In Salem, it was the devil. In the maternity ward, it was suffering that officially did not exist. In a bedroom at 3 a.m, it was shadows at the edge of vision and a pink box. The pattern is older than any of the substances. It is older than the word drug. And nowhere is it more completely documented than in a city in the Rhine Valley in the summer of 1518. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. She had not been invited to dance. There was no music. There was no occasion. She simply began, and she did not stop. She danced through the day, and into the evening, and through the night, and into the following morning. People watched. Some of them eventually joined her. The accounts that survive do not explain why. By the end of the first week there were dozens. By the end of the month, some chronicles place the number at several hundred. Dancing in the streets, in the squares, in the open spaces of the city, without ceasing, without apparent volition, some of them for days and some of them for weeks. The deaths, when they came from exhaustion, from the heart giving out, from the body reaching the limit of what sustained involuntary motion requires of it. The civic authorities of Strasbourg, faced with a situation for which nothing in their experience had prepared them, consulted physicians and guild masters, and arrived at an explanation that made sense within the medical framework of the time. The affliction was a fever of the blood, and it required expression. Suppressing it would be dangerous. They built a stage. They hired musicians, drummers, pipers, and cleared the Guildhall floor. They created conditions for more dancing, and hoped this would resolve the thing by allowing it to complete itself. The number of dancers increased. The deaths continued. The dancing plague of Strasbourg is documented in contemporary chronicles and in later histories, and it has attracted more explanations than almost any comparable event in the historical record. Mass psychogenic illness is the leading candidate, a social contagion, spreading through a community that was already under extreme stress from famine, disease, and economic instability, in which the behaviour of one person under extreme psychological pressure triggered a spreading collapse of normal social inhibition. This explanation accounts for the social dynamics of the spread, and for the way the civic authorities' response of providing music and space made things worse. The institutional endorsement of the behaviour embedded it more deeply in the social fabric of the event. Ergot is the other candidate. The summer of 1518 was warm and wet along the Rhine Valley, which is precisely the condition under which Claviceps purpurea thrives on rye crops. The convulsive form of ergotism, produced by the vasoactive alkaloids in ergot-contaminated grain, causes compulsive, uncontrollable motor activity. The accounts of the dancing plague describe exactly this: motion that the people undergoing it do not appear to be choosing, that they cannot stop, that continues independently of their apparent will. Ergot at the population level, entering the food supply through contaminated rye, could produce this across a community simultaneously. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. A community already suffering ergot-induced neurological disruption is a community whose members are already at the edge of their capacity to maintain normal social behaviour. A single person whose compulsive motion is chemically driven could trigger, in that primed community, a social contagion that then spread the behaviour beyond the population that was chemically affected. The chemical and the social running together, each amplifying the other, in a city that had no framework for understanding either. This is where the story has been going. Not toward a verdict on which drug is the worst or which century suffered most, but toward an observation that can now be stated plainly. The brain, deprived of its ability to verify what is real, does not go quiet. It generates. And what it generates is shaped by everything around it: the culture, the season, the fear, the available explanation, the deepest patterns of what the brain knows how to do. In ancient Egypt, what the brain generated when henbane removed its verification system was documented by physicians who incorporated the results into the longest surviving medical text in history. In medieval Europe, what it generated was the Sabbath, feasts and dancing with the dead, interpreted through the only available framework as diabolism. In Salem in 1692, what it generated was testimony, vivid, specific, emotionally coherent testimony about events that did not happen, delivered with complete conviction, which resulted in 19 executions. In the maternity wards of the early 20th century, what it generated was suffering that the institution decided did not count because the person suffering it would not remember. In Colombia, what it generated was compliance, a person walking to an ATM, withdrawing money, handing it over, with no subsequent account of having done so. In a bedroom at 3 in the morning in 2020, what it generated was shadows at the edge of vision, and a pink box and a 15-year-old in Oklahoma City who did not survive to file an account. In Strasbourg in 1518, what it generated was the compulsion to dance. Several hundred people, possibly chemically disrupted, possibly socially contagious, possibly both, doing something their bodies produced without their direction, in a city that responded by hiring musicians. The dancing eventually stopped. The accounts go quiet. The last entries in the chronicles thin out, and then there are no more entries, and what brought the plague to its end is as undocumented as what started it. The plants are still there. Datura grows on roadsides. Benadryl is between the aspirin and the cough syrup. Salvia is legal in most places and can be ordered online. The ergot that may have danced Strasbourg into its dead is controlled now by modern grain cleaning, which is one of the less celebrated achievements of agricultural technology, but it is controlled. The great ergot epidemics that moved through medieval and early modern Europe like slow chemical storms are not a feature of the contemporary world. The others have not been controlled. They have been documented, scheduled in some cases, warned about, placed on shelves, and left where they are. The mechanism has not changed. The brain in 1518 did what the brain in 2020 does when the same thing is done to it. Take away the verification, and the brain fills the space with whatever it has: the social world, the threat templates, the practiced routines, the most deeply encoded patterns of what the human nervous system knows how to produce. The content changes. The process does not. The women who confessed to flying at the Sabbath were not lying. The girls who named their tormentors in Salem were not, for the most part, performing. The dancers in Strasbourg were not choosing to dance. The man talking to his dead father in the emergency room in 1994 was not confused about whether his father was alive. They were all reporting what their brains had generated in the absence of the external world as a reference. The reports were accurate. The events they reported did not occur. This is the thing that separates deliriants from every other category of substance in the pharmacological record. Not the danger. Many things are dangerous. Not the strangeness. Many things are strange. The fact that the brain, running without its verification system, produces a world that is indistinguishable from the real one, populates it with the dead and the familiar and the feared, and delivers it to the person experiencing it without any flag, any marker, any internal signal that the world being experienced is the world being generated rather than the world being received. The part of you that would know is the first part to go quiet. That was where this started. It has been true of every account that followed. It will be true of the next person who eats the wrong plant, or takes too many tablets, or lights the wrong pipe in a bedroom. The mechanism is that old. The documentation is that consistent. And the brain, left to its own devices, will always fill the space. It just will not tell you that it is doing so. The last major ergot epidemic in Europe occurred not in the Middle Ages but in 1951, in the French village of Pont-Saint-Esprit. It began in August of that year, when residents of the village began experiencing burning sensations in their extremities, vivid hallucinations, convulsions, and episodes of violent and incomprehensible behaviour. Hundreds were affected, several died. Dozens were committed to psychiatric institutions, some of them permanently. The cause was determined to be ergot-contaminated bread from a local mill. The evidence pointed clearly at the contamination. The mill was identified. The source was traced. The event receded. The grain was gone. The illness faded. Most of the people who had been temporarily committed recovered. The ones who did not were explained as having had underlying vulnerabilities that the ergot had surfaced. What the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident demonstrates, beyond the ergot, beyond the contamination, beyond the individual cases, is that the mechanism requires no ancient history to operate. It requires only the conditions. Wet weather and a contaminated mill in a French village in 1951 produced the same general outcome as wet weather and contaminated rye in a Massachusetts settlement in 1692, and wet weather and contaminated crops in a German city in 1518. The chemistry is consistent. The century is irrelevant. And this is what all of it, the Strasbourg dancers, the Pont-Saint-Esprit villagers, the Salem girls, the man talking to his dead father, Rebecca in Oklahoma City, and every other person in these accounts, points toward the brain is a verification system. When that fails, through chemistry, through contamination, through a pink box and a challenge on a social media platform, what is left is not chaos. What is left is the brain running on its own, producing its most practiced outputs, its most deeply encoded social models, its most ancient threat detection templates, without anything to check them against. The results look like witchcraft. They look like divine madness. They look like a woman dancing alone in a street in July with no music and no occasion. They look like a teenager filming herself in a bedroom. They look like a man introducing his dead father to his wife, with every social grace intact, in a room where only one of those three people is actually present. They all look different. They are all the same thing,